Women's rights in the subsequent movement have become the well-denoted idea and continuous fight for equal rights between our two predominant genders. Prior to the traction and success of the movement, women still had very few rights in the 1900s and certainly no political rights. In fact, suffrage has lost the support of many people, including women, who view what they did with alarm. At the start of the 20th century, women had a very stereotypical role in British society. Married, they stayed at home to look after the children, while their husband worked and brought in a weekly wage. Single, they did work which usually involved some form of service, such as working as a waitress, cleaning houses, or cooking, and etc. Many young women were simply expected to get married and have children. For decades, women's progress in British society was honored by the words of Queen Victoria. Let woman be what God intended, a helpmate for man, with totally different duties and vocations. Coming from the most famous woman in the world at the time, men in power used these words to hinder the advance women had made. By the 1900s, women had been granted some improvements in their lifestyle via the law courts, but it was only in 1891 that women were told that they could not be forced to live with a man if they did not want to. But because nearly all women were relying on their husbands for a source of money, many women did live in miserable marriages. The myth that Victorian Britain was a time of great family values and that the family units stayed together is just that, a myth. Many wives could not leave their husbands even if they wanted to, simply because they did not have the financial independence that was needed to survive at the time. Also, a divorced woman was shunned by society and treated as an outcast. With these obstacles, many women were forced to stay in unhappy marriages. The women's suffrage movement, aka women's suffrage, was the struggle for the right of women to vote and run for office and is part of the overall women's rights movement. In the mid-19th century, women in several countries, most notably the US and the Britain, formed organizations to fight for suffrage. When World War I began in 1914, many suffrage organizations shifted their focus to supporting the war effort, although some activists continued to fight for suffrage. Because of manpower shortages in warring countries, women took on many roles traditionally held by men and changed the dominant idea of what women were capable of doing, giving further momentum to the suffrage movement. Britain's Parliament passed the Eligibility of Women Act in November 1918, which allowed women to be elected to Parliament. 10 years later, the Representation of the People Act granted women the right to the vote. Shortly after, a majority of European countries had granted the women to vote by 1920. By this time, many Western countries had granted women the vote, and so it became necessary to find a fresh focus or priority for the movement. Some women chose to carry on their work through the existing political parties. Both Labour and Conservatives built up a large female membership in the 1920s, backed by women's conferences and professional organizers. However, many feminists felt suspicious, partly because of their earlier experience with the politicians. It rapidly emerged that the parties wanted women's voluntary work, not to mention their votes, but continued to subordinate their interests, especially in matters of employment, to those of men. No party would take up equal pay, for example. Women also found it difficult to become candidates and MPs because winnable seats were reserved for men. Although several states extended the vote after the war, the movement generally had reached the end of its first cycle by the 1950s. It awaited a new generation of women in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany to emerge in the late 1960s and 1970s to restore its momentum and to redefine its aims of feminism.